Misha Gajewski, host of The Story Collider. Every week, The Story Collider brings you true personal stories that help us to discover the wonder of being a human. The natural world is amazing, and what makes Story Collider unique is that you discover how science can help make sense of it all. Of course, you can get Story Collider on Apple, Spotify, or anywhere you like to get your podcasts. And like potato chips, one story is never enough. It's a good thing we come out with a new episode every week. So go ahead, experiment a little. Check out Story Collider today.
Welcome to Who's in STEM. I'm Ken Ono, your host and the STEM advisor to the Provost and the Marvin Rosenblum Professor of Mathematics at UVA. Our goal is to evoke flights of imagination and wonder by showcasing the cornucopia of all that is STEM at UVA, the marvelous world of UVA science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. People picture scientists usually plugging away all day in windowless labs, conducting experiments in sterile environments, totally isolated and separated from the outside world, the real world. But communication is incredibly important to the practice of science. And so, in addition to experiments and digging through the data, scientists must be able to tell the public why their research matters. That's why, for the second year running, UVA has collaborated with the Story Collider podcast to reveal the vibrant role that science plays in all of our lives through the art of personal storytelling. In April, the Story Collider team came to Charlottesville to record a few UVA STEM leaders who told their own stories about their careers and their research. I hope you'll head over to their feed to hear a story from Professor Madhur Behl, the head of UVA's Cavalier Autonomous Racing Team. You can find links to Story Collider in the show notes below. But first, we have three other stories that were told at the live Story Collider event, which happened at Carr's Hill in April. Here is the Dean of UVA's Medical School, Melina Kibbe, talking about her journey from helping out at her mom's store to becoming a vascular surgeon.
So I was born and raised in Southern California, in a suburb of Los Angeles. My parents got divorced when I was really young. I was 5 years old, and I'm the youngest of three children. So very young when my parents got divorced. So I mostly grew up with my mother, and my father had moved away to a different state for his work. Now, growing up with my mother was really interesting because after the divorce, she became, to support herself and the family, a small business owner. And she became a small business owner of several interesting businesses. But her first and her main business was a 7-Eleven store. So here I am. I am a little kid, okay? I'm a second grader, and I'm put to work. So I start working at the 7-Eleven store as a second grader, and I start off by sweeping the parking lots. I still have a very vivid memory of every line in that parking lot. And my first payment was for candy. So I swept the parking lots for candy. It was awesome. I loved it. So then as I was growing up, I had some graduated responsibility. And then I remember very clearly when I was then allowed to stock the canned food aisle. So you think that's fun? It's not. It's pretty boring. And those cans topple over. So then as I got a little older, she actually allowed me, still as a kid, to stock the candy aisle. So that is awesome, right? So you're stocking the entire candy. A little what is going in the pockets, a little's going in the mouth. And it was back in the day when we still had the bottom whole row was all the 1-cent candy. I know there's some in this room who remember that. So that was really fun. And then the pinnacle was when I was allowed to stock the cold room. Because of course there's the milk and there's the soda, but there's the beer. And so as a kid, that was really cool to put the jacket on and go and stock the beer from behind. And then once I became a teenager, so I want to point out teenager, 13, I was allowed to run the cash register by myself. Think about that, because I reflect back on that, and I'm like, that is crazy. My mom was in the back office, so I was never doing it alone, but I was manning the cash register in a 7-Eleven store pretty much solo. So great skills for learning math, because that was in the days of the punch cash registers, not the electronic ones. You know what I'm saying? So, and I had some amazing experiences looking back that really impacted who I am today through working at the 7-Eleven store. And I'll just tell you one that I reflect on. Some crazy people come into 7-Eleven stores. I remember once I was at the register and some guy literally leaned over and said, "Do you want to buy some Black Beauties?" And I'm thinking the horse, the books. I'm like, what are Black Beauties? And the guy pulls out this bag of pills. I'm like, oh my God. So anyhow, needless to say, the answer was no. So lots of experiences like that. So, but working in the 7-Eleven store from the day of sweeping the parking lots to graduating all up to the cash register, I learned a lot, and I learned a lot about the value of the dollar and hard working. Now, I thought that I wanted to go and pursue a career in NASA. I am fascinated by space and planets, and I am convinced there is life out there on other planets, and I wanted to be that person to actually be an astronaut and go and explore outer space. So I go to high school, and everything changed as a freshman in high school. You all remember in high school when the nurses test everybody when you are a freshman? They have you bend down and touch your toes, and they're checking you for scoliosis, right? So I had the test. I bent over, and I hear a gasp. So guess what? I had a very severe curvature, an S curvature of my spine. And it was so bad that with the S curvature of my spine, my entire rib cage started turning. So when I bent to touch my toes, I had a humpback on one side of my rib cage. And that was what the gasp came from. And no one noticed. My brother, my sister, my parents, no one noticed. So when I then would go around showing everybody, look, I have a hump. It was really cool. Really cool until I ended up in the orthopedic surgeon's office within weeks and being signed up for surgery. So as a freshman in high school, I had my first experience with medicine with Dr. Gustafson. He was the orthopedic surgeon. And let me just tell you, going to his office was in the Bonaventure, downtown LA. That was back in the days when it was relatively new, very impressive. And so signed me up for surgery. And before I know it, I was under the knife. And what they do when you have scoliosis, and back in the day, is you're under anesthesia, face down, and they need to literally manually try to straighten your spine as much as possible. It's pretty brute. There's trying to straighten your spine. And then when they have it as straight as they can get it, they would attach a metal rod. And it's fixed at the top and the bottom. And that's what I have in my back to this day. So I underwent that experience. And I thought that what Dr. Gustafson did, he fixed me. It was the coolest thing ever. Then afterwards, throughout the rest of high school, he actually would rope me in and allow me to serve as like a counselor to other girls who were about to have the surgery. And so I would talk to them. I would tell them, what it's like before surgery, what it was like in the hospital. You could have all the ice cream and all the Jell-O you want, and your parents won't say anything. And also what to expect in the postoperative period. And I really enjoyed being able to be that voice and that sympathy and that compassion, because all the other girls who were about to go through this were really scared. So from that whole experience of being able to fix my problem and do it in a compassionate way, I knew right there that I wanted to pursue medicine, and I wanted to be an orthopedic surgeon. And there's nobody in medicine in my family. So then I go to college and thinking I'm going to be a surgeon, an orthopedic surgeon. So when you're in college, and many of you are in college here, so you realize that if you want to go to medical school, you might benefit from doing some research. So you remember that there's that time, especially after your first year, between your first year and your second year, where many will go and pursue research in a lab. So I did that, and I found a neuroscience lab that I was welcomed into in that summer. So I was paired up in this neuroscience lab with a postdoc who was on this project exploring this newly identified protein, and we knew nothing about this protein. Now, what is interesting is as a wee undergrad, what I was allowed to do. Not only allowed to do, what I was asked to do. So I was asked to dissect out the entire circle of Willis in the rat brain. Let me tell you what that is for those who are not neuroscientists. So that is the vasculature that sits at the base of your brain, and it literally is a circle, and then all the branches come out and feed your brain. So I was asked to dissect out the rat brain circle of Willis intact, without any breaks. And then once it's out, do the immunohistochemical staining for this protein. So I was like, yeah, rock on, let me at it. But why was I asked to do this? Well, my theory is that everyone else in the lab, all the other postdocs, grad students, they had all started caffeine. And they all had the shake. And so I was literally not on caffeine yet, no coffee yet. So I was asked to do this, and I did it. That was the cool part. I was able to dissect out this circle of Willis without any breaks after many, many attempts. But I was able to get that picture-perfect circle of Willis. So it was validating for the fact that I wanted to be a surgeon. But then taking it to the next step, doing the immunohistochemical staining for this protein, which we now know a lot about, it's called BNP, and really mapping out that distribution in the circle of Willis, and I also did it on the heart, and publishing the findings. I was literally bit by the science bug. And I knew from that experience, after my first year of undergrad, that I was definitely going to have a role in research going forward with my career. So then, my last pivotal moment was when I actually attended medical school. So in medical school, and this was back in the day when we had a lot of lectures that we sat through. I mean, we would sit through 6 to 8 hours of lecture after lecture after lecture in a lecture hall. So fast forward to first year of medical school. I'm sitting in one of these big lecture halls, and we have a lecture on atherosclerosis. A pathologist, a very well-known pathologist, came in and gave us the whole theory about, it was the one-hit injury theory to the endothelial cells which line the artery, and that leads to the development of atherosclerosis, and showed all the signaling pathways and everything. I loved it. I was just sitting there thinking, this is really cool. Then, a vascular surgeon came into the room in the last part of the lecture and showed a video of a very common procedure that vascular surgeons do. So it's called a carotid endarterectomy. So that is where literally your carotid artery, the one that you all feel for a pulse in the neck, you make an incision on the neck, you dissect out the carotid artery, and this is what the video showed. You get the artery out, you clamp the artery, the top and the bottom, stopping blood flow to the brain. You open the artery, and there's the big, juicy atherosclerotic plaque. And you then literally, I'm not joking, peel out the plaque from the artery. I equate it to like when you peel a sunburn. It's so addictive. You just keep peeling. And so you peel that plaque out of the artery till it's all gone. You've gotten it all. And then you sew the artery back up. Take the clamps off, you restore the blood flow to the brain, and all is good, and you have prevented that patient from having a stroke in the future. So I saw that video, and I literally turned to my friend, and I said, I am going to be a vascular surgeon. And that is something that my little second grade self, who was sweeping the parking lot in that 7-Eleven store, never would have imagined saying. And I did it.
That was the dean of UVA's medical school, Melina Kibbe. Next, we'll hear from UVA astrophysicist David Nichols about a bold decision that pointed his career toward the work that he truly loved.
So, 5-year-old me was a pretty quirky kid. When I wanted to entertain myself, my favorite book to bring around was an encyclopedia of aeronautical and military aircraft. So 5-year-old me would gladly carry around this book, read about planes, and if anyone happened to come up to me and want to know a little bit about the wingspan of a plane, I was the person to tell them about it. But at the same time, I was also an unusually cautious, deliberate, and I'd even say anxious kid. My uncle likes to tell a story about me when I was, again, 5 years old. I was visiting him in Boston, and it was chilly for us Californians. So he asked me, do you want to help me light a fire? What would be cooler than lighting a fire to a 5-year-old boy, right? This is in the fireplace, of course. But it turns out, for me, watching was more fun. So he proceeded to go ahead and light the fire in the fireplace. I watched, and after he was done, unprompted, I came up to him and said, I'm glad I didn't do it. It looked dangerous. Okay, so you can imagine there was a bit of a tension that this kid who liked knowledge, loved reading encyclopedias, also was kind of hesitant and didn't always like to seek out knowledge, particularly if it involved a little more hands-on things like lighting a fire. But you might then guess that this could have caused some tension at times in my life. And, for example, choosing a major in college was pretty tricky. The person who wanted to know everything in me didn't even realize I wanted to study science when I started college. I thought I'd take some humanities, some social sciences, and things would work out. And the way it did work out was I decided to study biophysics. And you might ask, why? Well, to study biophysics, you need to know biology, chemistry, physics, mathematics, programming. A little engineering wouldn't hurt also. So as you can see, it wasn't so much of a choice as, trying to do all that I could. And I'd figure out what went on later, essentially. So as I approached my senior year, I was still taking some of the core physics courses, and my advisor came to me and said, it would probably be a good idea for you to take an experimental physics course. At that time, I'd only done theoretical physics primarily, aside from some intro labs. And I said, okay, I'll give it a shot. I'll take an electronics lab. And that was fun. And then my senior year, I took an advanced physics laboratory. And I remember this one experiment. It may not sound fun to you, but it was kind of mind-blowing to me. We were behind this dark curtain with my lab partner. We got a laser. We shined this laser through a special kind of crystal, and we could essentially see the quantum mechanical properties of individual packets of light, photons, as they reached the photodetector. And then hours later, we made a model for what was going on. We connected it to what happened in our course earlier. And this was mind-blowing to me. It wasn't just understanding the physics, it was doing the physics and basically connecting reality as you measure it with what appears in textbooks. Okay, so this threw risk-averse and cautious me into a bit of a loop, right? I had always thought at this point that I was going to study theoretical and computational biophysics. And in fact, at this point, I was admitted to Caltech's PhD program with the intent of doing precisely this. But there was this, let's say, internal monologue in my mind that was going, well, you just learned about experimental physics. This is something new that you hadn't learned about before. Maybe you should explore this a little more. The other side of the monologue, of course, was, what are you doing? This is crazy. You figured out all this biophysics. You've done great research already. Why are you changing course? So the figurative angel and devil on each shoulder fought for a little while. And to my surprise, what seemed the more compelling argument was, why don't you try experimental physics? So I did that. I decided I'm going to contact professors at Caltech. I'm going to say, hey, do you have any positions in your lab? And you might guess that Caltech isn't really the place for amateurs. So when they saw someone with only advanced lab as their experimental background, not a lot of people wanted to take a chance on me. But there was one professor who did, and it was something I hadn't really encountered before. It was studying the properties of materials at extremely low temperatures. And the goal of this research was to look for new states of matter that can appear that will essentially form the hardware of a quantum computer. Okay, so this sounded really cool. I didn't even know it existed. So when the summer wrapped up and I started off at Caltech, I had my first day in the lab, which I'll sort of paint a picture for you. I walked out from the California sunshine into a sort of 1930s era Spanish Revival building. I descended down several stairs into the sub-basement into a concrete walled laboratory. It was unlike anything I'd seen before. There were electronics racks, taller than me. There were wires going everywhere. There were the refrigerators, these dilution refrigerators, which were giant cylinders, basically suspended from big structures that could only be opened up with a crane that was above. And the fridges themselves, this isn't your open the door and grab a Coke kind of situation. This is something that, is it's a maze of different valves, different tubes, different electronics, wires. I mean, I was overwhelmed. But thankfully, what helped me out was my advisor paired me up with a new postdoctoral scholar in the lab. Ghislain is his name, and aside from being a recent MIT PhD graduate, he was also an accomplished ballroom dancer. So as I was learning the ropes of the lab, he was, very gracefully gliding between the different stations. One day, we would essentially be at the computer learning some computer-assisted design software to make the masks for our photolithography. Other days, we would suit up into bunny suits, hairnets, coverings on our feet to go into the clean room, which you can think of as basically a loud, whirring room of fans under orange sodium lights. So that was a new and interesting experience for me. And then finally, after a couple days in this lab itself, we would make our semiconductor device, we would wire it up, and then we'd cool it down and run these fancy dilution refrigerators, which was a big process in and of itself. So it took a while, but after a couple months, I got to the point where I was actually doing pretty well in this lab. I was pretty independent. I could, make my own devices. I could even learn how to operate this dilution refrigerator, which was this maze of valves with nothing labeled properly and no instruction manual. But I eventually, figured out the working. But after a couple months, I sort of became acquainted with a quote that you hear in physics, which is due to the experimentalist John Manley, which is that experimental physics is 90% plumbing. Right? So things break. They need to be fixed. You need to be pretty handy. And I will be honest, that was not my strong suit. So things breaking, having to repair them, this was starting to wear down on me. And I realized that there's a reason that it's good to have a long research experience in a lab. You actually know what it's like. So when I was in my theoretical physics labs, I kind of knew how to deal with the problems. There were codes that weren't compiled, but I figured out how to deal with them. There were, thorny theoretical issues, but I would dive into the books. And that was, how I sort of thought about research. But I like to persevere. I don't like to quit, so I wanted to forge ahead. And I kept going for the rest of the year. But what really was the breaking point for me is that, unlike some of the earlier speakers today, I do not have the hands of a surgeon. One of the main challenges for me was wiring up these devices. So what that means is, imagine you're under a microscope, you're holding very delicately a gold wire the width of a human hair, and you have to attach it to a little pad of metal on the semiconductor at the same size. I was too caffeinated. I broke. I broke a number of these semiconductor devices. These are kind of one-of-a-kind things that are grown in only one lab in the world, I was not happy with how things were going. So as you can see, I wanted to return to my challenges of theoretical and computational physics, but cautious me didn't really know how to get out of this situation. I really didn't like quitting anything. I was the kind of person who always wanted to persevere. But at the same time, the realist in me thought, this has only been 1 year. I don't think I can do 5 more years of this to get my PhD. So it was a difficult decision for me, especially because the worrywart in me was thinking, well, what happens if I do quit? Am I out on the street again? What comes to people who don't complete their PhD? Do I have to go to the unemployment line? And this was actually where the director of graduate studies was very helpful for me, because I was nervous. I delayed talking to him, but eventually I worked up the courage and I told him, look, I don't think I'm happy doing experimental physics. And his response was, well, you'll be surprised to know you're not the first person who's told me this. So he was actually, very helpful. He said, look, I understand it's not ideal. You're about to start your 2nd year. You should find a project. But in the meantime, I can give you a TA position. You can be funded for a while and you can figure out your interests. So that checked off worry 1 off the list. But still, I didn't really think my options were that great. I just invested all this time and I was a competent, although sometimes struggling experimentalist. And I didn't really have a good alternative option at the time. The original plan to study biophysics wasn't really a viable opportunity anymore. All the positions in this lab had been filled. So I needed to find something new. So the new internal monologue was, well, what do I do? Do I do the risky thing of trying to find something new, or do I do the safer approach and just grinding out a couple more years? I'm capable of doing something difficult. I had a week to decide because the semester was about to start. So as you might imagine, I took the full week, but at the end of that week, I walked to my advisor's office for a meeting. I had ruminated on this long enough, and I told him, Professor Eisenstein, I'm going to quit this lab. To my surprise, I thought he'd say, well, you weren't the best experimentalist, I understand. He said the opposite. He said, well, I'm happy with your progress. Are you sure you don't want to stay? But at that point, my mind was set. So I said, no, I'm sure I'm going to leave. And I left his office that day with a mixture of anxiety and relief, where on the one hand, I was glad that I had the experience and got to know what experimental physics was like and saw what it was, and also determined that it wasn't for me and that I had the confidence and the ability to go into the unknown with only basically the optimism that some new opportunity would appear in my future. And it would, and it did. Thank you.
That was UVA astrophysicist David Nichols. And finally, we'll hear from UVA environmental scientist Karen McGlathery about her personal connection to the fight against climate change.
If you were to ask me where my home is, I would tell you that I live 10 miles west of Charlottesville on about 40 acres with beautiful views of the mountains. But I also tell you that I have a home on an island off of the coast of Massachusetts, about 30 miles off the coast. It was built in 1884. It sits on a shell street, a street that's paved with crushed scallop shells. The shingles are all weathered from the sea air. And the cottages are so cozy that you can sit in your living room and talk to your neighbor in their living room without ever having to go outside. And I've spent every summer of my life, a part of every summer of my life, in that cottage. The island itself is a flat pancake on the ocean. It's the terminal moraine of a glacier that receded 12,000 years ago. It's a pile of sand and rocks and clay, and it's covered with scrubby vegetation and grassland and steep bluffs that go down to the ocean. And luckily, our cottage is back from those bluffs. So my grandfather bought this cottage right after the Second World War ended. He was a British seaman. He fought in the British Royal Navy, and then he served a stint in the British Merchant Marines before he joined the Cunard Line as a first officer. I don't know if anybody know what the Cunard Line, but that was that famous passenger ships that brought people across the Atlantic and around the world before we had these big jetliners that took people doing that. So he told me, I remember about how he and my grandmother met. She was the youngest of 13 children. She lived in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. She was in 1923, she was in her early 20s. Her father gave her the choice of either going to college or going on an around-the-world cruise. So guess what she picked? She went on an around-the-world cruise. So in 1923, she set off around the world on the HMS Franconia. My grandfather was the first officer on that ship. So they fell in love somewhere on the ocean between Calcutta and Havana and Cairo. And when they decided to get married, she didn't want to live in Liverpool, England, where he was from, and he didn't want to live in landlocked Wisconsin. And so they settled halfway in Boston. So as the lore goes of our story, my grandfather in 1946 went with a friend who was interested in maybe buying some property or a cottage on Nantucket. And he went along because he was just itching to get closer to the ocean. And he was the one who came back with a cottage, $6,000 poor. He didn't talk to my grandmother. There were no cell phones. He didn't send her a telegraph. He just bought the cottage. He was thrilled. It was wild at that time. It had a lean-to kitchen. It was rustic. It was sitting on a dirt track that was rutted and totally open to the ocean elements. It was just perfect for him. She was really pissed off. So growing up there as a kid, there was always work to do. He ran it like a tight ship. His nickname was the skipper to his friends and to us and to his family. And we always had chores we had to do. We had to, before we could do anything fun, like go bike riding or go to the beach. And he always made us paint. If any of you have places near the ocean is really bad for paint. It's a constant process of painting. And I remember really clearly that my grandfather paid me 50 cents for every dollar that my older brothers earned for the same amount of work. Can you believe that? But it wasn't just 50 cents. It wasn't 2 quarters that I could use to buy comics or candy or ice cream. It was a Kennedy $50. And my young self, my young internal monologue was like, oh my gosh, this seems precious. This seems special. I'm going to put it in a box. And so I essentially made nothing for doing all the work that my brothers did. If I could find that box, I would be rich. I don't know where it is. I really don't know where it is. So that cottage has always been super special. It really is part of my identity, I would say. All the cottages on Nantucket and many places on the coast have names. My grandfather called it the Anchorage, and it really was an anchor. It was a place where was always our home, where we could always go to. It was our constant when everything else was changing in our lives. And I remember when one of my brothers, moved permanently to England. He moved to Manchester, just around Liverpool, where my grandfather was from. And my other brother and I decided the best way to bring the cottage to him and to bring the island to him was by the sounds of the place. So we recorded all the things that were memorable to us that identify the place. One was the creak of the hinge and the slam of the kitchen door, because no one would ever fix it. No one ever will fix it. And so that was the first thing. The next was the sound of our footsteps on the crushed shell street. We recorded the sound of the distant waves as we took the evening walk that my grandparents did every night before they went to bed, and that is our family tradition. Being out 30 miles out to sea, you can imagine the sky is really dark. The stars are amazing. If we could have recorded the sound of the shooting stars that we saw, we would definitely have done that too. So when you live on an island, storms are a way of life. That's just what you have to deal with. And when a storm, like when a nor'easter came and hit the coast of Nantucket, instead of sheltering in the anchorage in the cottage, my grandfather would say, "Karen, get your wellies on and get your slicker, we're going down to the beach." And we would walk down to the beach and we would stand there. I mean, he was just enthralled and fascinated, and I was just enthralled and fascinated. We would watch the waves as they would churn. We didn't talk, we would just stand there and watch. I remember feeling the sting of the sand as the wind was whipping it up against my legs. I think if I could think of a word that really describes that, I think it would be awe. I mean, it was really, really enthralling. I think that's when the ocean really entered my DNA, when it was just really clear to me that's what I love so much. I still am drawn to beaches when there's a big storm. It's not always the smartest thing to do, but I'd still like to go to beaches. And I think about them differently now. For sure, I think awe, but I also I think alarm. I've seen firsthand, I know from my research, that climate change is making storms more frequent, more intense, more destructive. I've seen a house in our village literally being washed into the ocean. I've seen that beach that my grandfather always took me to, just eroded into a thin strip of sand. We always bike up, and my kids, we always bike up to the lighthouse that is there on the easternmost part of the United States to ward off ships from the shoals that are just located offshore. That lighthouse has been moved back 500 feet because of the erosion of that bluff. And just a few years ago, I was up there and I was biking like I normally did to the lighthouse, and I stopped to watch a house that was being lifted up, put on steel railings, and then moved 100 feet to the north towards the lighthouse. 100 feet. We just finished basketball season. That's the length of a basketball court. It's not very much. So I was just watching. I was taking pictures for my class. Thought they'd be interested in seeing how crazy people were. And I started talking to the man next to me, and he turned out to be the owner. I didn't tell him what I did, but I said, "What? So why are you doing this? Why are you moving it just 100 feet? And he said, "Well, I have 5 feet between my house and the edge of the bluff where it is now. If I move it over here, I have 25 feet between my house and the edge of the bluff." I didn't say anything about how fast that bluff could erode, that 25 feet could be gone in a year. I just went on my way. But I looked up when I was leaving, and I saw that the name of his house, believe it or not, was Slip Sliding Away. So now I spend a lot of my time on a different coast on the eastern shore of Virginia, where those barrier islands are battered by storms in the same way that Nantucket is, that I have seen Nantucket be. And it's an interesting place there because the story of the eastern shore, if you don't know it, is that in the early 1930s, so after the Great Storm of 1933, and that was before they named storms, that storm was so intense that these thriving communities that lived on those islands picked up their homes, picked up their churches, picked up their schools, put them on barges, and floated them across and resettled on the mainland. So they abandoned the island. We talk about that now with just, angst that anybody would think about doing that, but 100 years ago, people did that. So I think about that now when I go to Nantucket. I often fly. It's a long way to go, rather than taking the slow ferry. Flying is actually a good thing because I am one of those rare marine scientists who gets incredibly seasick. So I'm happy for the opportunity to fly. But when I look out at the island, I look at this flat patch of land 30 miles out on the ocean, and I think, of course it's vulnerable to climate change. Of course we have to think about sea level rise and storms. I don't think that with all those billionaires on Nantucket now, I don't think abandoning the island is an option. That's not going to happen. But I also don't think that being complacent about the effects of climate change is either. So our cottage, the Anchorage, has been in our family for 5 generations now. It is 140 years old. I am quite sure when my grandfather took me to the beach, he didn't think about how that storm or those storms that we saw could really threaten the island that he cared so much about. I think he was just thrilled by the power and the majesty of the ocean. But I think about that all the time now. When one of the big things that as a kid, when we first got to the island, is we'd pile out of the car when we got to the beach and we'd run to the edge of the bluff to see how wide was the beach, how narrow was the beach, what happened with the storms over the winter, and where is going to be the best sandbar for body surfing. And now, when I do the same with my kids, the beach is always narrow. It's always eroded, and there's almost never a sandbar. In fact, my kids don't even know how to body surf. And so this just gives me even more urgency, the sort of personal connection I have with a place that is threatened. I think I'm lucky to be in a job that I am where I can actually make a difference to my family, but to others. And it makes it even more urgent for me to do something that can protect that place, the house the cottage that means so much to my family, so that it can do the same for the next 5 generations. So thank you very much.
That was UVA environmental scientist Karen McGlathery. We hope that you enjoyed her story, as well as the other 2 stories by Melina Kibbe and David Nichols, and we encourage you to support UVA STEM superstar Madhur Behl by listening to his story and subscribing to the Story Collider. There's a link to their feed in our show notes. Many thanks to Misha Gujewski and Shane Hanlon and the whole Story Collider team for this collaboration. I'm Ken Ono, STEM advisor to the Provost and the Marvin Rosenblum Professor of Mathematics, and you've been listening to Who's in STEM.